And so, speaking of that, let me just offer a brief recap. Will somebody please read for me verse 20, chapter 5, verse 20 of Matthew.
For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven.
Okay, so what we have been doing over it's been a while, but it's been a while since we've actually been in it. It's been probably several months since we've really been into this, but we've been studying the Synoptic Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew and Mark and Luke. They're called the Synoptic Gospels. Who can tell me why they're called that? They're similar. The word synoptic means similar. So that's why it's called that. And we've just been walking through the synoptics. For the last several months, we've been looking particularly at the Sermon on the Mount. And so we went through the Beatitudes. We looked at the Beatitudes as virtues. We looked at some of the other teachings that Jesus has. And this section, this large section here, kind of the second half of chapter 5, if you will, I really believe that verse 20 is the key for us in understanding all of Jesus' teaching that comes afterward. So he says here, unless your righteousness is greater or exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees and the scribes, you will not enter into the kingdom of heaven. And from there, he goes on and he begins to teach. You have heard that it was said by them of old time, you shall not kill. And so what he is doing when he does that is he is taking the tradition of the scribes and the Pharisees, and he's saying, this is what they say, but this is what I say. And he's not taking the law of God and setting it aside. He's not changing it. He's not altering God's law in any way. What he's doing is actually faithfully explaining it. He's faithfully expounding it, contrasting that faithful explanation of God's law with the tradition of the elders, the tradition of the scribes and the Pharisees that had developed over time. And so we see this. You know, the Pharisees said, you shall not kill, because whoever kills is in danger of the judgment. But Jesus says, whoever is angry with his brother without a cause is in danger of the judgment. The tradition of the elders, they said, you have heard that it was said of time of old, you shall not commit adultery. But Jesus says that anyone who looks on a woman to lust after her in his heart has committed adultery already in his heart. He goes on, he says, again, you have heard it said of them of old that I skipped one. He says in verse 31, it has been said, whoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But Jesus says, I say to you, whoever will put away his wife except for the cause of fornication causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries her that is divorced commits adultery himself. And so we've seen here, 1, 2, 3 examples of Jesus contrasting the righteousness of the Pharisees, the explanation and the tradition of the scribes and the Pharisees, over and against Jesus' own explanation of what God's law means, Jesus' interpretation of what God means when he says these things. And this theme is going to continue, where Jesus is contrasting the traditions of the elders, the traditions of the Pharisees and the scribes, and what he's trying to communicate to his people here is that we look at the Pharisees as though they were something special. We look at the Pharisees as though they were the most righteous people, because they were on the outside. They tithed their mint and their dill and their cumin down to the final grade. But what Jesus' criticism of them is that they were hypocrites and that they elevated their own traditions over and above what God's law taught. So Jesus is doing two things. First of all, he's knocking the Pharisees down a peg. He's saying they're not as righteous as they think they are. They're not as righteous as you think they are. But he's also faithfully explaining what God's law means and how these other traditions from the Pharisees have gotten it wrong. And so that's a kind of a brief summary of what we've done so far here in the Sermon on the Mount. Most recently, of course, we talked about the issue of divorce. And that we went on a bit of a rabbit trail with that, but I thought that was an issue that was important enough that we should not only kind of give it a surface level look, but we should see what all of Scripture has to say about the issue of divorce. I felt like that was an important enough topic that we spent several weeks delving into that issue to kind of figure out what's going on there. Are there any questions or comments about anything that we've talked about so far about that summary? Does that kind of get us back up to speed? Good. If we're all up to speed, let's just continue moving forward. So today we're going to continue to move forward. Will somebody please read verses 33 through 37? This is going to be our topic of study this evening.
In chapter 5?
In chapter 5 of Matthew, yes, ma'am.
Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need is to simply say yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one.
Okay, so this is Jesus' teaching here concerning oaths. Concerning oaths. And before we get into this, I think it's important for us to look at a little bit of Old Testament background. In our culture, in our society, we don't really deal with oaths and vows and things like that to the same degree that they would have in the ancient world. I don't know about you, but for me, even approaching this text, it was kind of foreign. I felt like I was missing a little bit of context. So let's ask the question, first of all, what is an oath? What is an oath in the biblical framework? An oath is any time you would invoke the name of God to add credibility to what you're saying. So in the same way that someone, if you're like grilling your kid or something, and I didn't do it, I swear to God, that is an oath. You're invoking the name of God to add credibility to what it is that you're saying. And we see many oaths throughout the Old Testament. We even see oaths made in the New Testament, even by the Apostle Paul in some of his writings, where he appeals to God, he appeals to heaven, he appeals to the elect angels, and he is saying, making an oath in that sense, he's appealing to something greater than himself in order to add credibility to what you're saying. That's basically what an oath is. You're swearing. That's what an oath is. When you would swear on the Bible, if you're going to testify in a court hearing or something, when politicians and elected officials swear on a Bible to uphold the Constitution, they are taking an oath. They're appealing to something greater than themselves, just as a way to add some clout to what it is that they're saying. Any questions about what an oath is? Does that make sense? When we think about a vow is something similar, but it's a little bit different. So a vow would be a situation where it's like a pledge. You're saying, I will do this, God, if you will do that. And so I've had times in my life where I've been like incredibly ill and in great deals of pain, and even before I was a believer, and probably even sometimes since I was a believer, where you're just like in this state of pain, and you're saying, God, just take away this pain. I swear, if you will just take away this pain I'm feeling, I will never sin again. I will never do any kind of sin ever. If you take away this pain, I will never do anything wrong again. This is a form of a vow. God, if you do this, I will do that. One famous story of a vow comes from Martin Luther. Martin Luther was on his way he was kind of in between careers. He was thinking he wanted to be a lawyer. He didn't really feel like he wanted to be a lawyer. And one day he was traveling home and he got caught in this great, huge thunderstorm that was terrified him. This is in his biography. And Martin Luther, during this thunderstorm, he made a vow to God. He said, God, if you let me survive this thunderstorm, I will serve you forever. Well, he survived the thunderstorm, and then he pulled out of lawyer school and went to the monastery, and he became a monk. And St. Augustine honored that, or not Augustine, I'm sorry, Martin Luther honored that vow that he made to God in the middle of that thunderstorm. God, if you save me, I will be a monk. And that's what he ended up doing. That's what he went and did. So that's an example of a vow. Any questions about vows or oaths or what we're dealing with? Does that clear it up at all? Very good. So that's what a vow or an oath is. Let's look together at Deuteronomy chapter 23. There are several Old Testament passages that talk about oaths. One is found in Leviticus, and I don't remember exactly what the chapter and verse is. Another long section about oaths you can find in the book of Numbers in chapter 30. Like basically that entire chapter is dealing with oaths and when they are binding and when they are not binding. But there's one particular passage that I wanted to look at tonight, just for the sake of time. I think it's the most relevant. I think this is the one that Jesus is probably appealing to. It's probably the one that he has in mind as he is giving his teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to look at Deuteronomy chapter 23 together. And will somebody please read verses 21 through 23?
When you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it. For the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and it would be a sin to you. But if you abstain from vowing, it shall not be a sin to you. That which has gone from your lips you shall keep and perform. For you voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God what you have promised with your mouth.
Okay, so what's going on here? Someone explain this back to me.
So if you vow anything to the Lord, then you must perform it or obey it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's
Yeah.
bad.
Any vow you make, it says it will surely be required of you. If you make a vow to the Lord, it says if you invoke the name of God making a vow, it says it will surely be required of you. You must perform the things that you have done, the things that have come out of your lips, those things which you have promised. If you make a vow to the Lord will require it of you. But what else does it say? Particularly in verse 22.
If you abstain from vowing, it shall not be sent to you.
If you do not make a vow, you cannot sin by violating the vow. If you do not swear a vow unto the Lord, then no vow is going to be required of you. Very clearly, he's teaching us here that when we vow a vow, the Lord will require it of us. But if we don't vow a vow, there's no sin. Very simple. And here's what I want us to understand about this. Whenever we make a vow, if you make a vow, invoking the name of God in your vow, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, but what that does, it's not necessarily a sin in and of itself, but what it does is it creates the occasion for sin. What do I mean when I say that? You can vow a vow, that's not necessarily a sinful act. If you do not obey your vow, then that's the problem, it will be required. But when you make a vow, that's a dangerous thing. Because it creates the occasion for sin. It creates an opportunity for sin where previously there was no opportunity for sin. It's like, for instance, if you were a married person and you found yourself in a situation where you were alone with an individual of the opposite sex, that's not necessarily sinful in and of itself. What's the problem? It creates the occasion for sin. It creates an occasion for sin where otherwise, if you weren't in that situation, the occasion for sin would not exist. The same thing is going on here with the vow. That's what we see in Deuteronomy. If you make a vow, you have to honor it. But if you never make a vow, then there's nothing to honor. Okay? Let's go back to where we were in Matthew 5. And we see Jesus kind of reiterating that. Don't we? He says, you have heard that it was said by them of old time, do not forswear yourself, do not make an oath, but you will perform the oaths that you make, or the vows that you make. Oaths and vows are they're related concepts. They're not exactly the same, but they're related. And he says, I say to you, do not swear at all. Do not make any oaths. Don't make any vows, Jesus says. Why? Because I think Jesus understands what was written in Deuteronomy. When you swear an oath, when you make a vow, you are creating the occasion for sin. If I appeal to God, if I say I swear to God about something, I am making that oath, I am appealing to God in that behalf. What's the problem with that? The problem is I'm very ignorant. I don't know all of the conditions of any situation. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. I don't know really anything about anything. And so what can end up happening when I make the oath appealing to God, I might end up breaking the third commandment and taking the Lord's name in vain. Whereas if I would have never sworn that oath in the first place, I wouldn't have created that occasion for sin. I'm not taking the Lord's name in vain simply by avoiding invoking his name in the first place. Does that make sense? Any questions or thoughts about that concept, that idea? Because it's very important moving forward.
I know some people won't even like swear on, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, go ahead and God. You know, affirm that, but they, a lot of people won't swear that.
And that's probably in reference to when Jesus says, do not swear at all, And it's probably a safer bet. It's better to be safe than sorry, I guess, is kind of the mindset that goes into it when in that kind of situation. So there are people who they don't swear in any capacity. And I respect that. That's somebody who's trying to honor and obey God's word. I can respect somebody coming down on that position. So, any other thoughts or questions or comments?
What if they're in court though and they have to swear?
Okay, yeah, there are examples, and if we have enough time at the end of all this, I would like to talk about some of these examples, or maybe exceptions, or things like that, because that will come up. And if we have enough time, I'd like to get into that more than right now. I really would like to kind of move through, but I want to come back to that question if we can. Because there are situations where we see, like I said, in the New Testament, we see the Apostle Paul making oaths in the letters of the New Testament, appealing to God. Was the Apostle Paul sinning when he did that? There are situations, if you're elected to public office, if you're testifying in court, where the law requires you to swear an oath to tell the truth or whatever. And so what do we do in situations like that? Are we forbidden by this passage? Just to give you my short answer, I think the answer is no. I don't think we're forbidden from taking oaths ever. I don't think the Apostle Paul was sinning when he appealed to God to boost his credibility. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And we'll get into the details if we have a little bit of time. Anything else? I do want to mention, just as an aside, that, and if you read some of the ancient commentaries, for instance, in reading St. Augustine and his commentary on this, he makes the claim that the Jews in Jesus' day, and this is going to shed a lot of light on the answer that Jesus gives. One of the things that the Jews would do in Jesus' time is, instead of invoking the name of God for their vows or for their oaths, they would invoke heaven, or they would invoke earth, or they would invoke Jerusalem, or even their own head, or whatever. You hear people say, like, I swear on my mother's grave, that kind of a thing. But part of the reason why they did that was to avoid culpability. Part of the reason why they did that is because the idea was, well, if I'm not invoking the name of God, if I'm not swearing to God, then I can break that oath. I can break that vow, and it's not going to be counted as sin against me, because the law says if I invoke the name of God, I have to do it, not if I invoke the name of heaven, not if I invoke the name of earth. There are many Christian commentators who say this was a practice of the Jews at that time, and we kind of see that in Matthew 23 when Jesus is prescribing woes over the Pharisees. One of the things he says to them is, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, because you make oaths by the temple, and you say you don't have to uphold them. But you say if somebody makes an oath by the gold in the temple, then they have to uphold it. He says, what's more important, the thing that is sanctified or the thing that does the sanctifying? The gold is just gold. What makes it holy is the fact that it's in the temple. So in that, we see kind of this idea that the Jews had different ideas. If you swear by this, it's not that important. But if you swear by this over here, then you're bound to it. So that's kind of the idea that's going on. Now, as Judaism developed over time, and you can read this in the Talmud, and you can read this in the Mishnah, which came hundreds of years after Jesus, this stuff was kind of codified. The Jewish position came down to, if you swear by heaven, you are invoking the name of God indirectly. So swearing by heaven is the same thing as swearing by the name of God. Swearing by earth is the same thing as swearing by the name of God. So today, that is the Jewish position, but in the time of Jesus and in the early church, there was debate. There was different schools, there was different thoughts and ideas about this, and it appears that one of the ideas going around at Jesus' time, at least amongst some of the scribes and Pharisees, was that if you swore to anything else that wasn't God, that it didn't matter that much. That you could break that, you could violate that. It didn't really matter. So that's important context. Any questions about that idea? Perfect. Well, let's get into Jesus' explanation. So we saw verse 33. Again, you have heard it said by them of old, you will not forswear yourself, but you will perform to the Lord your oaths. Again, Jesus is appealing to the traditions, the elders, the teachers. This was a very typical rabbinical way of Jewish teachers to teach. They would appeal to these other traditions, these other authorities. And then Jesus, as he has done throughout the entire Sermon on the Mount to this point, he says, but I say to you, verse 34, swear not at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, neither by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Let's stop there for a second and look at these things that he's saying. So he says, swear not at all. Jesus is echoing what we learned there in Deuteronomy. When you swear an oath, when you make a vow, you are creating the occasion for sin. It's better to not create an occasion for sin. It is better to avoid the occasion for sin. That way you can avoid sin, right? But what he's saying is it's better not to swear. It's better not to swear an oath. He says, don't swear by heaven. Why? Because it's God's throne. And that really speaks to that idea that the Jews thought, well, if I swear by heaven, that doesn't count because I'm not invoking the name of God. But what Jesus is saying is, no, God is in heaven. The heavens are God's throne. Don't swear by earth because the earth is his footstool. It belongs to him. You can't swear by heaven. You can't swear by earth. Those things don't belong to us. They're not ours. We don't have the ability to invoke those things. They don't belong to us. And when we do, if we're trying to avoid invoking the name of God, we're failing because those things belong to him. When you swear by the great city, that great city belongs to the great king. It belongs to the Messiah. It belongs to the Son. You can't swear by something that doesn't belong to you. You have no power over it. It is where God resides. It all belongs to God in the first place. So anything you swear by, it belongs to God. It's his. Any thoughts or questions about that idea? Again, we can't control what happens in the heavens. We can't control what happens on the earth. We can't control circumstances. And this is especially true when you're talking about vows. When you're talking about making a vow. I'm reminded of this example of a vow in the book of Acts. There was a group of men who they all took a vow. They said, we're not going to eat until we kill the Apostle Paul. Well, there's one problem with it. Paul found out about their plan and he escaped. But they made a vow to not eat until they killed him. And so that is a vow that they are going to be held accountable for. It's like I read in a book somewhere, a very wise man once said, we will give account for every idle word that escapes from our mouth. We will give an account for all of the things that we say. We will give an account for all of the words that we speak. And so if we make a hasty vow, if we make a hasty oath, ignorant of the circumstances and without any control over the circumstances, again, it is creating an occasion for sin. Any questions, thoughts, comments about that? It's pretty straightforward. Is there any question about this idea of occasion for sin and what I'm talking about when I say that? You may have not ever heard that phrase. And I just want to make sure we're all clear about that.
Just give you the opportunity. I mean,
That's right.
opportunity.
Yeah. You know, if you're an alcoholic, walking into a liquor store is a bad idea. It creates an occasion for sin. Walking into a bar, whatever. If you say, well, I'm ministering to prostitutes, that's why I'm going to the brothel. That's probably a mistake. You're creating an occasion for sin. This is an example of letting your good be evil spoken of. We want to avoid those things. Think of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. What did Joseph do when he was caught in a situation where there was an occasion for sin?
You ran out the door, right?
He ran out of there. He got out of that situation as fast as he possibly could.
Left his coat behind.
He left his coat behind. That's right. He said, I'm out. I'm fleeing. So this, that's what we're talking about. It's just where there is an opportunity. It's putting ourselves in a bad position is what it is. And Jesus says that's what we're doing when we swear oaths, when we make vows. We're putting ourselves in a position to sin when we otherwise wouldn't have been in that position. Look at what he says in verse 36. Because you think, okay, well, I don't own the heavens. I don't own the earth. I don't own Jerusalem. Those things don't belong to me. Those things belong to God. But you know what I do have control over? I have control over my own head. I have ownership over my own body. I have ownership over my own life, right? My body, my choice, right? Well, look at what he says in verse 36. Neither shall you swear by your own head. Again, because you have absolutely no control over those things. You cannot make one hair on your head black or white. Your own head doesn't even belong to you. Your head belongs to God. God knows the very number of hairs on your head. And He's the one who makes them black or makes them white. He's the one who is in control of all these aspects of our life. You see, you're not getting out of it if you swear by heaven, because that's where God resides. You're not getting out of it if you swear by earth, because God also resides there. You're not getting out of it if you swear by the great city, because that city belongs to the king. You're not getting out of it even if you swear by your own head, because your own head doesn't really belong to you either. You don't even have control or power to change the color of your hair. We have no control over the circumstances that we might face. Go ahead.
The kids do.
The kids have great control over how many of our hairs turn white. It doesn't go the other direction, but that's a one-way ratchet, and they're pretty good at that. Yeah, God ordains the means as well as the ends, as some say. So, yeah, that's all very true. Yeah, that's funny. I myself have recently been developing this practice, which has helped me a lot in the way that I respond to situations. I've beginning my day by trying to anticipate all the things that could go wrong throughout the day. Trying to anticipate certain things that might trigger me or stress me out or make me angry. Certain things that I might face throughout the day. I try to anticipate them early in the morning before I face any of them, so that I can kind of work through in my mind, how am I going to respond to this? That way I don't respond in an emotional negative way, right? I'm trying to kind of work through all that junk before it ever happens, so that when it actually comes, I can deal with it in a more responsible, godly way. And it took me about one day of doing that to realize that it is impossible to anticipate all of the things that could possibly go wrong. It was about my first day when the first thing I didn't anticipate in the first 20 minutes of being awake happened, that I realized, there's no way that I could possibly do this. So I have incorporated into that practice now of appealing to God and saying, Lord, you know the beginning from the end. You're the author and perfecter of my faith. You know everything that's going to happen. Prepare my mind and heart for whatever may come, so that I can deal with it in a godly, responsible way. And that practice has actually been very helpful for me. It's helped me to control kind of my reactions and responses to various things. Now, I say all that to say that I totally lost my train of thought. I say all that to say that is me acknowledging I don't control circumstances. That is me acknowledging that I cannot even anticipate all of the circumstances that might come. How foolish is it for me to make a vow or to swear an oath that I'm going to do something when literally a million things could prevent that from happening. There's a million things that could stop me. And then if I swear an oath or I make a vow, now I am held accountable for that vow that I made. I put myself in a bad position. Does that make sense? But we go on.
That's just like making promises with people.
Right.
That I will do this or I will do that. And something comes up in the way and it's beyond your control.
That's right. Yeah.
What about making promises, oaths and vows to yourself, with yourself? That question makes sense?
Yeah.
What is your take on that?
Well, it's probably unwise to even do that because here's what happens. In my experience, this is what happens. You make a promise to yourself and you have great intentions, but then you fail and you violate your promise. And that is associated with a great degree of shame and guilt and regret. And over time, what I have done in my life more than once is I have broken these promises over and over and over. And now it's like I look in the mirror and I don't even trust the guy in the mirror. You know what I mean? Because I keep breaking all these promises to myself. I'm like degrading my own confidence in my own character because I've just constantly am breaking these promises, breaking these oaths. I think that the principle of avoiding swearing oaths, making promises or vows in that sense, especially in like the kind of solemn invoking the name of God sense, that is a mistake. I think that that's setting yourself up for failure. It might not necessarily be a sin, but it is creating the occasion for a great degree of negativity to be involved. That's kind of my take on the fly on that.
Just for what Gretchen said, instead of promising that you're going to do it, just make it a goal, and then just take baby steps to get to that goal, and then once you hit that big goal, then you'll be proud of yourself. So instead, just don't promise it, just make it turn it into a goal of something that you want to do.
And to kind of backdoor that, one thing that I have found in many of the endeavors that I have engaged in is that if I will, this is going to sound super gay and cringe, but if I will focus on like the positive aspects and kind of ignore the negative aspects, that kind of positive mindset actually makes a huge difference. What do I mean? I mean, if I will stop focusing on my failures and begin to simply celebrate the wins and celebrate the victories and celebrate the things that I did right, it changes my whole perspective. That doesn't mean those things go away, but what it means is I'm no longer focused on perfection, I'm focused on the progress. I'm no longer focused on fulfilling this eternal oath, but I'm focused on just moving forward one step at a time, one day at a time, one victory at a time. And those things, as time goes on, kind of grow and develop and stack on top of each other. It's like eating an elephant, you do it one bite at a time. How do you overcome ingrained patterns of sin in your life? One day at a time, one victory at a time, one overcoming temptation at a time. And if you will just focus on that kind of aspect on it and not focus on I'm taking this thing away, that's the negative aspect, but focus on the I'm doing this positive thing. So like if you got drugs or alcohol, for an instance, you're not saying I'm taking away this thing I love. What you're saying is I'm giving myself an opportunity to live in freedom. And just that shift off of kind of the negative aspect of things onto the positive aspects of things, very practically, I think can help in what we're talking about. Does any of that make sense?
Does a New Year's resolution count? I have never been able to keep one.
I think as long as you're not swearing an oath or making a vow, then no, it doesn't count. It's just, this is kind of a goal. But again, it's the same thing. Like you make a New Year's resolution and you say, you know what, this year I'm going to stop eating ice cream and I'm never going to eat ice cream again. And then, on January 2nd, when you're like getting some ice cream, well, now you've just, you've broken your word to yourself. And when we do that hundreds of times over and over and over, it creates a really negative cycle in our own souls that's not good for us. And so that doesn't mean we shouldn't make goals. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have resolutions or be moving towards something. But I think it's best to just keep moving forward, keep putting one foot in front of the other, minimizing our failures and maximizing our successes. That's kind of where I'm at this point in my life, and it seems to be pretty helpful in a lot of different areas. It's good. Any other thoughts, questions, comments? Well, let's look at Jesus' prescription. So Jesus said, don't do this. That's the negative aspect of his teaching. Do not swear oaths. Because if you swear an oath, you're creating an occasion for sin. You do have to uphold whatever it is you're saying. He's saying, don't do that. Instead, positively, we should do this. And what is that? Verse 37.
But let your communication be yea, yea, or nay, nay, for whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil.
Basically what he's saying is say what you mean and mean what you say. That's pretty much it. Say what you mean what you say. There shouldn't be a necessity to swear an oath because we should be spending a lifetime developing a good word. Where when we say we're going to do something, people can just trust the fact that we're going to do it. If we say we're not going to do something, people can just trust the fact that we're not going to do it because we have lived a life of speaking simply, a life of simplicity, and we follow through on the things that we say. Does that make sense? So getting into application, let's talk about application. We've seen the Old Testament kind of background. We've seen how Jesus responded to it. Very simple. Jesus is simply saying, this is a bad idea. To swear an oath, to make a vow, this is a mistake. It creates the occasion for sin. Rather, just let your communication be simple. Let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. And that's enough. Anything more than that comes from the evil one. Anything more than that, once again, creates the occasion for sin and stumbling and taking the Lord's name in vain. And we don't want to do that. So what's our first point of application? The first thing we should do is begin to cultivate a good word. And maybe that begins with cultivating a good word to ourselves. I mean, we've talked about that tonight. You know, if you want to do something, do it. If you tell yourself you're going to do something, do it. And begin to develop a good word with yourself. But in all of your relationships, begin to develop a good word with your spouse, with your children, with your neighbors, with your people that you work with your boss, with the people who work for you. Whatever the case may be, begin to cultivate a good word. If you say you're going to do something, just do it. Follow through. If you say you're not going to do something, don't do it. And when you fail and when you make a mistake, don't make excuses about it. Just own up. Say, hey, I failed. I'm going to do better next time. And continue to move forward. That's how you cultivate a good word. The way you cultivate a good word is simply by following through with whatever you say you're going to do. Does that make sense? Any questions, comments, or even advice on that? Experience with that? Anybody got anything?
What about if you change your mind?
Okay.
She said I change my mind all the time. And a lot of times I'm goaded into doing something that I really don't want to do.
Yeah.
And then I change my mind. I said, well, I finally give in. I said, yeah, I'll do it. And then after I think about it, well, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's tough, right? And there are situations where, you know, sometimes you get into something and you end up, for whatever reason, changing your mind or realizing this you bit off more than you can chew or whatever. And I think in a situation like that, the best thing is simply to be honest. But if you avoid putting yourself in a position where you've made an oath or where you've made a vow, and that's different than simply saying, yeah, sure, I'll do this. If you say, yeah, sure, I'll do this, but you don't make an oath or you don't make a vow, well, you're not sinning if you don't end up not doing it. But if you make a vow and you vow in the name of God, I'm going to do this thing, or you make an oath, I swear it on heaven that I'm going to do this for you, and then you don't do it, well, now you're kind of stuck in your oath or your vow, and it's really best to follow through. But that's what Deuteronomy was saying when we looked at it. If you avoid making that vow, there is no sin. There is no problem. You know, people can change their mind. That's okay. I think the best bet to do is just to simply be honest and to say, like, look, I'm not going to do this. For instance, Gretchen got this camper. I said, Gretchen, I'll level your camper. I'll do all that for you. Long story short, I had to come back and say, listen, I'm not leveling that camper. I'm not going to do it. I tried, gave it the old college try, had some issues. I'm not going to do it. I never made an oath. I never swore. I got into something and I realized this is beyond what I can or want to do, and I'm just not going to do it. I changed my mind. And there's no sin in that, but there is that doesn't help you cultivate a good word necessarily, but there isn't any sin in something like that. Does that make sense? Does that address the question? Any other thoughts or comments or questions? That was a good one.
He never says yes right off the bat, it's always no.
Well, I'm reminded of a story where he talks about two brothers, and the father went to the brothers and he said, go out and feed the goats and take care of stuff. And one of the brothers said, oh yeah, I'll do that. And then when the father left, he never ended up doing it. He got busy, he did something else. And then the older brother said, there's no way that I'm doing that. But after the father left, he went out and he did all the chores and he took care of the things he said. And Jesus says, well, who actually was the righteous one? Who actually did the will of the Father? Was it the one who said, oh yeah, I'll do that, and never did it? Or was it the one who said, there's no way I'm doing that, but ended up doing it anyway? It was the latter, right? So, that, for what it's worth, there's that. Any other questions, comments? That was good. But that's what we want to do. We want to cultivate a good word. Here's another thing we want to do. We want to break the habit of oath making. As I was reading through a lot of the stuff that I was reading through, preparing for this, a lot of the people mentioned the idea that sometimes people get in a habit of making oaths. Sometimes people get in a habit of just carelessly speaking, swearing to God or swearing on your mother's grave or whatever, making vows or making promises in a hasty fashion. Sometimes people just develop a bad habit of making oaths. And if that's you, if you have developed a bad habit where you kind of swear oaths or you do make vows or whatever in that sense, if that's something that you just kind of do reflexively without even thinking about it, that's a habit that you need to break. You need to stop doing that. And the answer, the way to stop doing it is to just simply stop doing it. Like, you have to really control your tongue. I know it sounds so simple. Like, that's really the answer for everything, though. You want to stop doing something, you need to just kind of stop doing it. And again, very practically speaking, if that's your struggle, if you have a problem with that, I would just advise to move forward and celebrate the victories. Every day you don't make an oath, that's worth celebrating. If you have a day where you swear an oath, just confess it, put it under the blood, and move forward with your life. But don't beat yourself up because you whatever, you know what I'm saying? If you have that bad habit of swearing to God, making oaths like that, you need to stop. You've got to stop doing that. That's a terrible habit. You're creating occasions of sin in your life for no reason at all. That's something that's fully within your control. God tells us that we need to keep a careful rein on our tongue. And so that's something that you're going to need to do if that's a struggle for you. Any questions or comments about that? So we really have 2 points of application. The 2 points of application are, one, we need to cultivate a good word. And that's in all of our relationships. Again, like I mentioned, with whatever it is, if we say we're going to do something, we need to just do it. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. There's no need to swear an oath. Let's just cultivate a good word so that people believe us when we say we're going to do something. I would say here's the whole main message here. We need to guard our tongue. We must cultivate simplicity of speech. The Bible tells us to be slow to speak and to quick to listen. The Bible tells us that where many words are, sin is there also. It tells us that the tongue is a very small member, but it can control the great ship. It's a very small flame, but it can create a great blazing wildfire. We must control our tongue. Jesus told us we will give account for every single idle word we speak. We must control our tongue. Life and death in the tongue. We must cultivate simplicity of speech. That's one thing that really stood out to me. Here's, a lot of times people, they carry on, I swear to God, and on this and that. And it's that's just being flowery and extra for no reason. We need to just cultivate simplicity. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Follow through with whatever you say. Here's a very important thing. I think this is important for us to hear. Never say something that you're unwilling to follow through with. Never let anything come out of your mouth that you are either unable or unwilling to follow through with. For instance, if you're a parent, if you're a husband, if you give commands to your children, to your wife, never give a command that you're not willing to enforce. If you're not willing to enforce the command, you better not give that command. Because then you'll be sinning. For instance, this is something I've had to think about a lot with my kids. How easy is it for us as parents to just start dishing out a bunch of commands right away to our kids. And our kids are bound by the law of God to obey us when we command them to do something, right? What am I doing? Every time I issue a command to my children, I'm creating an occasion for sin. Both for them and for myself. Because if they disobey my command, they're sinning. And then if I fail to discipline them for violating my commands and sinning against me, now I'm sinning. And so every single command, every time you tell your kids to brush their teeth, every time you tell your kids to put their dishes up, every time you tell your kids to make their bed, you are creating an occasion for sin. Does that mean you should never issue a command? No, we have to issue commands, but we got to be very careful about the commands that we do issue. And this is a journey that I have been on as a parent over the last couple of years, really realizing just how important that is. Like, is this something I'm willing to enforce? Am I willing to spank my kids behind what I'm saying right now? Am I willing to create that kind of punishment behind what I'm saying? Think about any law that exists. Every law that exists on the books is punishable by death. It is able to be enforced by death. And I just point to the issue of George Floyd for a second. Remember George Floyd, how that he died in police custody, and there's a lot of dispute about that. I'm not getting into the details of that. But George Floyd was a guy who was being detained for using counterfeit bills. Counterfeit bills. And he lost his life as a result of that encounter he had with the police. Because every single law that exists, from a speeding ticket all the way down to registration of your vehicle to murder, the police will enforce those laws up to the point where you end up dead. If a cop pulls you over for speeding and you start acting wild and crazy in the car, you could end up getting shot behind a speeding ticket. We must be careful about the commands that we issue because we are creating occasions for sin. Not only commands, but threats. This is a common one. This is especially prevalent among mothers. Mothers, I'm sorry to say, you often have to resort to threatening your children in order to do things because, and here's what happens. You make the threat, the kid doesn't follow through, you don't follow through on the threat, now the kid knows they don't have to listen to you. Because when mama made a threat, mama didn't follow through. And so we have created now this occasion for sin because we were careless with our tongue and we threatened to try to do something. And then when they didn't follow through, they sinned. And when we don't follow through with what we threaten, we're sinning. We must be careful about the things that come out of our mouth. Commands, threats, vows, anything. Never say something that you are either unable or unwilling to enforce. Any questions or thoughts or comments about that? That's kind of the end of what I have to say as far as this goes.
Don't spank them in front of me.
Oh, Lord, no.
Don't get a kid in front of me.
Well, don't spank a kid or don't hit a kid.
Don't hit a kid in front of me.
Spanking and hitting,
No,
are they the
take
same
it
thing?
Somewhere else. Control your anger towards the infant until you're out of my sight. And then you can beat them up all you want to.
It cost me several $100.
Yes. Well, can't do it.
Well, you got to be careful if you're ever spanking your kids in public because spanking is not as
Correct.
enforced or not enforced, but it is not smiled upon today the way that it has been in history. So you do have to be very careful about spanking your kids in public. I kind of have my philosophy on spanking is this. Nobody asked. I'm going to share it with you anyway. When you have young kids that are like, close to a year up to like 3 or 4 years, I think those kind of kids should be getting spankings like all the time, like literally a dozen times a day, all the time. You got to understand, when I say spanking, we're not talking about like whipping somebody with a switch. We're talking about like a corrective pop. It's like a corrective swat. That's all that it is. It's nothing more serious or less serious than that. But young kids at that age ought to be getting like 1,000 spankings a day, basically. And then as they get older and they graduate into the next phase, the spanking level decreases significantly. They might be getting spanked a couple times a week or whatever, from like the ages of 4 to 7. And once you get from like age 7 to 11, spankings, if you were good and faithful in the first 2 stages, from the age 7 to 11, typically speaking, you're not going to have to spank very often. Maybe like once a year, twice a year over something that's important, something that was big. And then once a kid gets like over the age of 11, you should never be spanking a kid that is that old. That's kind of my mentality when it comes to spanking. A lot of people run into problems with older kids because they refuse to handle the problems when they were young. But if you reverse that, if you kind of nip those bad things in the bud as they get older, it becomes less and less as they are trained by the discipline. That's the whole point of it. It's like training an animal. Because children, before they reach like an age of reason, are in some ways closer to animals than they are humans. They don't respond to reason. You can't explain to a 3-year-old why what they're doing is wrong. They just don't get it. You just have to like zap them with the electric fence like you would a goat or something. Like that's just how it works. So that's kind of my philosophy when it comes to spanking. Of course, that doesn't apply to every individual kid is different. Everything is different. Sometimes you can be really faithful and loving in your discipline and still have wild, rebellious kids who are crazy. And sometimes you have kids who are just like they're like angels and they never get in trouble at all. So it is a case-by-case individual basis. But if I was to lay down kind of general principles for spanking, those would be my general principles for spanking.
You never asked me what I would do if I came across a situation.
Well, what would you do?
I'd be standing in your face. Between you and a child.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting take. So,
Well, just there's reasons to have a corner timeout. You don't have to hit anybody. There's no need for hitting. But I mean, you know, as long as you don't do it in front of me, you're cool.
any other thoughts, questions, comments on anything that we've talked about?
I want to be in a fight. Never have been, but I've always.
See, I don't think of hitting and spanking as the same thing.
Because they're not the same thing.
Oh, so you have a degree in which you beat them?
I've never
Yeah,
been in a
sure.
fight.
Yeah. Any other thoughts, questions, comments about spanking or about what we're actually talking about, vows and oaths and those kinds of things?
Some people don't know when it's proper, it's so irate.
Well, in conclusion, I would simply say this. What we're seeing here from this teaching is that our Lord is reminding us of the danger of swearing oaths. Anytime you swear an oath, anytime you make a vow, it is creating an occasion for sin. It is creating an occasion that is unnecessary. And we also run the risk of taking the Lord's name in vain. There's a lot of ways to take the Lord's name in vain, and saying GD is not the only way. If you invoke the name of God in an oath or in a vow, and then you violate that oath or you violate that vow, or you're lying about what you're saying, you are taking the Lord's name in vain. And that is a violation of the third commandment. Even if we don't swear on his name explicitly, even if you swear by heaven or earth or Jerusalem or by your own head, all of those things belong to the Lord. Anyway, you're still swearing on his name. Instead, we should seek to cultivate a good word, a word which can be trusted, and we should be careful to speak simply and to avoid unnecessary oaths.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So, what about when you go, like, to court, you're subpoenaed and you have to do that?
Okay, we have just a couple minutes. I'll just answer that question.
Position that,
The question is it ever a sin to swear an oath? And I would say no, it's not a sin if you swear an oath. There are situations where swearing an oath might be necessary. It might be required by the law, such as situations like that. If you're a politician being sworn in, if you're at court, you might have to swear an oath. And that's not a sin. Just don't violate your oath. You swore the oath, swear it. And besides that, we see the Apostle Paul, as I mentioned, swearing oaths at various points of letters in the New Testament. And one of the things that St. Augustine said in regards to that is sometimes it's necessary to swear an oath, not because your word isn't good, not because of some weakness in you, but because of the weakness of the person you're talking to, because of the weakness of the people you're talking to. And here's a good, for instance, let's say, you're talking to a woman who just came out of like an abusive relationship or a bad situation, is accustomed to being lied to and treated bad and all this stuff. And, you're not that kind of person. And so sometimes, and you might have to reassure that person, even with an oath, that, you're not going to do that. You're not going to lie. You're not going to hurt them. You're not going to do all that kind of stuff. That's a very dangerous game to play. But sometimes you have to swear an oath. That's just an example. Not because of your own weakness, but because of the weakness or the infirmity of the people to whom you're speaking. When the Apostle Paul swore an oath to these churches he was writing to, it wasn't because the Apostle Paul didn't have a good word. It's because their faith was weak. And so he swore an oath for their sake. Not to boost his credibility, but for the sake of the one listening. And St. Augustine said that is not a sin. It's not a sin to swear an oath. And in a legal context, it's not a sin to swear an oath either. We just have to be very careful. If you swear an oath, it will be required of you. Any other questions, comments, thoughts on that or anything else?
It's like when I was sworn an oath in the military. I can tell you that I never once in Vietnam said, well, I'm doing this for my country. I'm doing it for myself to get out of this. Or my friend next to me. That's just, they thank us for doing military service, but 99% of the people in the military, they're not doing it for that. They're doing it because they have to. But
And I don't know the oath that is sworn, so I don't really know what to do with that, but it makes sense. What you're saying makes perfect sense. When you're out in the trenches, like, who cares about the president? Who cares about Corn? Who cares about any of that? We're just trying to get out of here. It's just me and the guy next to me. That's all that matters. And I understand that. That makes perfect sense. So, and I don't know that would be a violation of any kind of oath in any way, but I don't know the oath, so I don't know. Anything else? We had good discussion tonight. Awesome. Well, Brother Charlie, if there's nothing else, will you go ahead and close us in prayer this evening?